within internal impression that carry out an apparential consciousness, apparentialis Bewusstsein, and external perceiving, an appearing of a physical thing, an appearing of an event. If I carry it out within internal reproduction, I am reproductively conscious of the appearing. But then I am reproductively conscious of what appears, just as I am impressionally conscious of it in the other case. In the appearing, something temporal appears, the external temporality. The appearing itself is something temporal. It itself appears in internal consciousness. Now, however, let us take a different experience, constituted impressionally or reproductively in internal consciousness. A judgment. Specifically, let us say a judgment directed towards something ideal, towards something non-temporal, or a wish, a volition, and so on. The judging has an entirely different, quote-unquote, sense, an entirely different correlate from the correlate the appearing of an individual has. It has a different objective reference. It is not directed towards something temporal, and so it is in all of these cases. What about reproductive judgment, wish, and so on, with respect to their relation to quote-unquote objectivity? The objectivity is not reproduced. It is not represented. It is precisely not something temporal. We therefore have to say, among experiences, there are two very different kinds. Intentional experiences, that is, experiences that have the characteristic of, quote-unquote, consciousness of, cogitationis, and non-intentional experiences, the primary experiences, the sensual experiences. The cogitationis, in turn, break down into two classes: presentations and non-presentations. Presentations, the apparential cogitationis, have the peculiarity that they are impressions of when they are impressional experiences, and reproductions of when they are... No. Where is that? Have the peculiarity that they are impressions. Impressions of when they are impressional experiences, and reproductions of when they are reproductive experiences. However, this is not true of the rest of cogitationis. But what kind of wise discovery is this? Is it not mere nomenclature? Hence, we must say, every experience admits of a fundamental modification. It is called the reproductive modification, and in relation to it, the unmodified experience itself is called impressional experience. We now have two cases: either the experience, which itself is an individual experience of which one is conscious as an individual experience, is a presenting experience. That is to say, a consciousness in which an individual, quote-unquote, appears, quote-unquote, presents itself. Or it is a different experience, and specifically a consciousness of something objective that is not intended as something temporal. Now, however, two different kinds of object relations belong to every reproduction. The two cannot be grasped in the same way, but by means of different attitudes or foci. Number one, the reproduction is the reproduction of the corresponding impression. I can find in this reproduction itself. Number two, the reproduction has a relation to something objective that would actually be something objective in the corresponding impression. The reproduction of an experience, e.g., of an act of judging, of an act of perceiving, something external, is, on the one hand, a reproduction of this experience. Hence, I can direct my regard toward the act of perceiving, or an act of judging, of which I am reproductively conscious. On the other hand, I can direct my regard toward, quote-unquote, what is perceived, toward, quote-unquote, what is judged, which in this case, however, are given in consciousness reproductively. Now, the respective ways in which I am conscious of these two different kinds of objects are very different. One way is that of the relation of consciousness to an individual. And this is surely an integral part of the essence of consciousness. But the other way is the one in which the reproduced experience hovers before me as a cogitatio. And here what is noteworthy is precisely that a cogitatio can not only exist impressionally in relation to internal consciousness, but can itself be an impression of something that, for its part, is again an individual, its temporal being. Inherent in this, the second object relation can be of the same sort in this respect, namely as far as the characteristic of the object of as an individual is concerned, but it can also be of a different sort in this respect. If we have made this our own, and we understand the following, the terms impression and reproduction can acquire different senses. Let us take the term impression first. Impression can, number one, be the name of the experiencing, or the internal consciousness in which the experience as an individual becomes constituted. Reproduction can then be the name for the modification belonging to the representation of the experience. Thereby, a peculiarity of internal consciousness is established, specifically as the consciousness of an individual. The individual here is the experience, which is characterized as impressional or reproductive. Number two, experiences themselves, we said, can be the consciousness of an individual and be of a kind of analogous to the internal consciousness above, and can therefore be impressional or reproductive. If we gather together consciousness of every kind insofar as it is consciousness of an individual and characterized as impressional or reproductive, the concepts of impression and reproduction acquire a universal sense, satisfying precisely the sense of quote-unquote presentation or stellum. If we take in addition the universal distinction pertaining to the consciousness of intuitiveness, clarity, genuineness, whether this is the same, I do not know at the moment, we then have specifically perception and fantasy, imagination, as particular antitheses within intuitiveness. Number three, if the concept of impression, or respectively of reproduction, is limited in this way, then impressions, for example, become separated, on the one hand, into internal impressions, and, on the other hand, into impressions of which one is impressionally conscious internally, and which do not, like internal impressions, have experiences as their objects, but are experiences themselves, and do not have experiences as their object. What one is conscious of in an experience that is not itself an impression of an individual is not something of which one is impressionally conscious, then. In a judgment, one is not impressionally conscious of the state of affairs. A value, an ethical command. The same is true of reproductions. What one is conscious of in a reproduced experience that is not itself a presentational experience is then not said to be reproduced. One is not conscious of it reproductively. The reproduced experience is itself characterized reproductively, but it is not the reproduction of something. Number 4. But then one needs a pair of names in order to express the distinctions in the mode of consciousness that internal impressions and internal reproductions possess, not with respect to their objects, the impressional and reproductive experiences, but which they prescribe for these experiences with respect to their objects. Number 5. Now, how must the terminology be chosen? If one has once recognized that the distinction seen first between experiences that are quote-unquote original and those that are quote-unquote reproduced is subordinated to the universal distinction between individual objects of whatever sort which one is aware, quote-unquote, originally at one time and, quote-unquote, reproductively at another, then one cannot help but choose the universal impressions corresponding to the distinction. Hence, one can do nothing else but distinguish between impression and reproduction, as we did above, and choose in the same way in the case of the concepts of presentation, perception, fantasy, and then indicate the particular species. For example, internal and external reproduction, and so on. Consequently, we have no choice here. On the other side, this prescribes what quote-unquote reproduced and quote-unquote impressed signify. What is impressed is something objective that belongs to consciousness as an individual, and this is also what is reproduced. We then have the object correlate characterized phenomenologically as impressional and reproductive. A reproduced act of judging, therefore, signifies a judging that is precisely an individual object in the internal reproduction in internal consciousness. On the other hand, the state of affairs is not reproduced. In the same way, if I have a wish, reproduction, in internal consciousness, then precisely the wish is reproduced, but not what is wished for. Now, what should we call such objectivities belonging to experiences of which we are reproductively conscious, inasmuch as they are not presentational experiences? The term must be chosen in such a way that it also encompasses being reproduced within its universal signification. For reproduced objects are also objects of experiences, of which we are reproductively conscious. Perhaps it is best to use the expression, quote-unquote, to hover before us. Vorschweben. This is then suitable for every intentional content that we can find in reproductive acts. For example, the correlates that are certainly not objects and yet are given in consciousness. Bewusst. It's a German word that I'm not familiar with. Bewusst. In a manner different from objects and given in reproduction acts in a way different from the impressional. However, we also need a name for the objectivities and correlates of impressional experiences, quote-unquote, acts, cogitaciones. We can perhaps say actually given in consciousness, a special case in connection with presentations actually presented, more precisely presented in person, if the act is a perception. Hence we have the difference between actual, given in consciousness, and inactual, given as hovering before us. Given in consciousness reproductively. Reproduced is suitable for experiences, the term reproduced, of which we are reproductively conscious. Can one say, assuming that the barking of a dog is reproduced, I am reproducing the barking of a dog? Of course, one also says, I represent the barking of the dog. I represent a judgment. I am conscious of every experience impressionally. I am impressionally conscious of a judgment that I am experiencing. Experienced judgment, experienced volition, experienced feeling, even experienced reproduction of a judgment, and so on. If I experience a judgment, the state of affairs is not experienced. If I experience an act of deeming likely, the probability, likelihood, is not experienced. However, I am conscious of this in a manner entirely different from that in which I experience a judgment reproduction and have together with it a reproductive consciousness of the state of affairs. The judgment consciousness is reproduced. The state of affairs is not reproduced with it. Should we say that the judgment or any experience, that all that I am experiencing, is something of which I am impressionally conscious, something I experience? That the object of the experience is something of which I am impressionally conscious? I am conscious of the experience reproductively. It is reproduced. I am conscious of the object of the experience reproductively. But what about the specific likeness between experiencing and external perceiving? Reproducing and external presenting, fantasying. Is that a specific likeness? The it itself, the intuitive, the actual, the originary. Yes? I experience a judgment, a wish. This shit was World War I. This is the fucking Great War. Jesus Christ.